Embodied Cognition, Digital Cultures and Sensorimotor Debility. This presentation is a synopsis. The full paper can be found at my website. The general thesis of this paper is as follows. A central concept in the culture of digital computing and its intellectual patrimony is the axiomatic separation of matter and information, hardware and software. This separation of matter and information is nothing but a reification of the Cartesian mind-body dualism. These two dualisms are both axiomatic and fictitious. The influence of the Cartesian dualism on Western philosophy, Western culture, and specifically Western scientific culture has been both extreme and destructive. Those educated in Western traditions come to understand and implicitly believe in the idea that the self is made of two parts, mind and body. This leads to the assumption about intelligence and cognition, specifically that cognition occurs as the manipulation of symbols via logical procedures that constructs the body as dumb meat. This conception of the nature of being is particularly problematic for artists and others whose work is spatially and materially engaged, from cyclists to chefs, for whom intelligence is inseparable from skilled action. The uncritical acceptance of the hardware-software mind-body dualisms in computer culture has reinforced a general acceptance that brains and computers are fundamentally similar and that exchanges between humans and computers involve exchanges of information. This conception neatly sidelines the body as if that exchange was occurring or could occur via direct neural jacks. The uncritical acceptance of the hardware-software mind-body dualism, particularly in HCI, human-computer interaction, has generated conceptual blind spots because the role and significance of the body in cognition has been elided. The general illusion of the significance of embodied dimension of lived being in design of computer hardware and software has led to the emergence of a range of widespread cognitive and sensorimotor debilities that are increasingly becoming public health concerns. A wholesale reconfiguration of conceptions of human cognition and lived being along embodied extended lines would correct some of these blind spots and would open the way to more effective, more human-computer interaction. The input processing conception of the von Neumann architecture, the basic architecture of every computational device you've ever owned, is quite obviously borrowed from the industrial production line. Raw materials are assembled into information objects and output in packets. This architecture mirrors mechanistic theories of human cognition that separate and serialize sensing, mental processing, and acting. This architecture makes sensing and acting peripheral, and assumes all the cognitive heavy lifting is in the processing inescapably of symbols. The problem is that this conception of cognition is simply wrong. At the heart of modern computing is code. This writing in machine languages that organizes generic and unformed computational matter as a specific machine that breathes a kind of life force into dumb minerals. As hardware-software is mind-body reified, so the privileging of code is hylomorphic. According to Aristotle, creative action is always preceded by a creative idea. A preconceived idea is imposed on formless matter. Embracing computational analogies is to embrace dualistic hylomorphism as a native quality of the world and as an accurate representation of human cognition. But any artist, any chef, knows that the work is in the making, in a sensitive attention to process in process. The privileging of code is the privileging of the immaterial symbolic over the embodied and enacted. So it is that, in 2020, roughly 35 years since the introduction of the personal computer, 25 years since the emergence of the World Wide Web, and 15 years since the emergence of mobile computing and handheld devices, we are coming to understand that some subtle and insidious effects of the technology, or more accurately, of emerging technosocial formations, from the development of new kinds of adolescent neuroses to the destabilization of political systems of powerful nations without firing a shot, the ecstasy of communication has become the agony of communication. Corporations are always keen to show us the advantages of their products, and no doubt they have wonderful qualities. We enjoy access to and sharing of information of all kinds, opportunities to create communities of niche interests, location of obscure artifacts and commodities, and all the rest. But we must note that the form our digital world takes is almost entirely the product of a desire for maximizing financial profit. The digital corporate community, almost without regulation, has realized unimaginable wealth and is still laughing all the way to the bank. There is no reason that we ought to believe that their products are ethical, good for us, or created for our benefits. This new techno-political establishment has manifestly been slow or disinclined to recognize or admit culpability that may negatively impact their reputation or bottom line. Hello, Mark Zuckerberg. Hello, Jeff Bezos. Given all this, any attentive student of techno-political history will be unsurprised when negative effects of new technologies show up, innocent people, communities and environments are negatively impacted, and these impacts are suppressed, denied or otherwise made dubious by vested interests. We are now seeing such impacts, psychological and physiological, especially among the born digital generation. This may sound like a trivial thing to say, but skilled making involves the combination of bodily precision and application of calibrated muscular force with active, iterative discernment and decision-making. For the entirety of human history, from Paleolithic flint knapping to blacksmithing to the making of Swiss watches, human culture has been defined by skilled activities that involve the combination of judgment with commensurate bodily force. Through the 20th century, as electrical infrastructure proliferated in wealthy industrialized countries, the idea of labour-saving devices animated the design and production of commodities, from vacuum cleaners and washing machines to power steering. In post-industrial nations, physical labour has been reduced to a bare minimum. The swiping of touchscreens, the tapping of keyboards, a kind of work in which both sensory motor precision and physical effort have been actively designed out, as has cognitive effort, such as using mental arithmetic to calculate the amount of change needed for a purchase. We call this insidious trend user-friendly or intuitive, but it often means de-skilling and dumbing down. This dumbing down is rooted in a fundamental humanist assumption, as fallacious as it is fundamental, that there is a distinction between mind work and body work. But the idea of a separation between mind and body is ideological, counterfactual, and without any scientific basis. The corollary to this argument is that skill-intelligence binary is also false. The skill-intelligence dual is the mind-body dual. The false distinction between skill and intelligence has directed the development of technologies, and specifically technologies that are deemed cognitive, along paths that seek to minimize bodily engagement, dexterity, and physical effort. The rise of information technologies, themselves rooted in dualistic notions, has compounded the problem. Along with well-publicized range of advantages of digital technologies that we all take pleasure and profit in, and that hardware, software, and internet companies take pride in publicizing, there's an emerging litany of social, physiological, and cognitive deficits that have received limited attention for obvious commercial reasons. Many of these can seem trivial, or are represented that way by vested interests, but taken together, they indicate a disquieting trend. Along with social, psychological, and political implications, there is a category I call sensory motor debility. A substantial reconfiguring of cognitive and sensory motor capabilities is occurring in communities where screen-based technologies are ubiquitous, especially, for obvious developmental reasons, where infants and children are overexposed. Some of this is trivial, but some, I believe, is substantive, negative, and problematic. Clinical and anecdotal evidence point to a rapid decline in a variety of key physiological markers of bodily competence, from visual acuity to manual dexterity, particularly amongst young adults during the last 15 to 20 years, and this time period corresponds with the emergence of the born digital generation, those children who have been weaned with digital touchscreens. It's a bald historical fact that 30 years ago, and for the entire history of the human race, except in rarefied contexts, screen-based interactivity simply did not exist. Proprioception and kinesthesia are the source for knowing ourselves and the world, and these senses bring vision and hearing into focus. The kinds of hands-on making and play that were more or less the entirety of childhood experience in the past have been substantially replaced by screen-based activities. An assessment of the general impact of this is long overdue. If you'll pardon the scatological pun, the interfaces are hitting the fan. Some may argue that skills of map reading, like mental arithmetic, are just redundant in our technological context. Clearly, as we adapt to new technologies, our capabilities and skills change. But there's a fine line to be drawn between technology-specific skills, like using an abacus or a slide rule, and the loss of cognitively fundamental understandings which undergird not simply bodily skills, but our ability to form intuitions and utilize concepts and metaphors. Where does this sensory-motor debility come from? In my opinion, the cause is an unfortunate combination of two trends: the general phenomenon of the digital, and in particular the overexposure of children from a young age to touchscreens, graphical interfaces, and the false physics of animation and games, and the neoliberal rationalization of schooling, focusing on STEM learning that valorizes abstract thinking and devalues or eliminates art and vocational classes and facilities. This combination has created a generation for whom the minimizing of lived experience of material engagement has resulted in shortcomings in embodied cognition and basic common sense. There's a deep irony to the fact that it was precisely a shortage of this kind of common sense that caused the failure of the first generation of symbolic AI in the 1980s. The long-standing Enlightenment humanist privileging of reason and abstraction, combined with the emergence of a technology of abstract symbol manipulation and a neoliberal educational agenda that slashes soft and applied aspects of learning because they're expensive, have created a perfect storm of sensory-motor incompetence. This scenario should be of immediate concern to artists, artisans, craftspeople, makers of all kinds, as well as to educators and proprietors of educational institutions, not simply because hand-eye coordination and refined sensory-motor capabilities are demonstrably positive qualities for humans to have, but because, according to contemporary theories of cognition, capabilities traditionally understood as mental are understood to be based in bodily experience. There's an urgent need to examine and critique computer tools and software interfaces in terms of their relationship with human sensory-motor capabilities. Thank you.